Welcome to another episode of Pandemic Dialogues. In this episode, we consider three models of morality as our characters come to grips with a worsening situation as the summer heat exacerbates the already dire situation in Iran. As always, please review and rate this podcast in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcast app is. New reviews and ratings help others discover this podcast. You can also engage with us on Twitter by using two hashtags, hashtag Camus, C-A-M-U-S, and hashtag ASU. Thank you for listening, and now on to Pandemic Dialogues.
Welcome back, everybody. Howdy, Luke. How are you?
I'm good, Trevor. Thanks for asking. I have still been a little worn down and from the usual semester stuff, but reading this text from Camus has been a great pleasure, as has been the early feedback that we've been getting from a handful of individuals on Twitter. I do want to mention them just because we've had a great conversation, and I will mention them by their Twitter handles. Sirius Taurian, I believe is how you say it. Indie Travel Photo, Bartels 2, my friend Mark Levecchi, who goes by M. Levecchi. All of them you can find on Camus, hashtag ASU, and hopefully we'll get some more from other folks. But how are you doing?
Yeah, well, no, this has been a happy diversion, let's say, and similarly waiting for the semester to end, and day by day we proceed. And yeah, absolutely, I would encourage anyone else to tweet at us or use the hashtag Camus, hashtag ASU, and we'd be happy to hear from you, and we can get a broader discussion and dialogue going. But as we begin our dialogue and discussion here, let's begin by just giving a quick overview. So we are discussing today sections 6 to 9 of the second part. So part 2, this is a continuation from our discussion last time. And this lot of sections opens by recalling Father Panelus' sermon, which we discussed last time. There's an emphasis on the increasing rates of contraction and death, along with rising temperatures in the hot climate. It's actually something we haven't talked a lot about. I don't think it's incidental, especially as I'll just say here and put in a plug for Montesquieu in light of French thought. Climate is an important part of thinking about the broader laws in human relationships, but as an aside, there's a sense of concern about lawlessness emerging, a rising kind of discontent among the people, troubled hearts, hardening hearts of the townsfolk. There's the tourist trade and certain commercial activities are apparently now dead. And there's a combination of what the narrative calls, on the one hand, a veto on pleasure and a mood of reckless extravagance that's slowly setting in. And so in terms of plot, Theroux approaches Rieux with a plan, and an important discussion on matters of duties, God, suffering, and purpose ensues, which we'll want to turn to. Theroux begins executing his plan of forming these sanitary groups, citizens who join in the fight in combating plague. We have reflections on whether these and similar acts are heroic and necessary, and how necessary heroism may be. And by the 9th or last section of part 2, we find discussion of Rambert's obstinacy in continuing to find a way out of town, his solicitation of Cottard's assistance in working with smugglers, which eventually fails, another intense exchange over virtue, courage, heroism, love, the power of ideas, and the manner of common decency. And part 2 ends here with Rambert's decision to join in the work of Rieux and Theroux, at least until he finds a way out of town.
I think that's a pretty good summary of where we are in this second half of part 2. It's, I think, important to reiterate that Camus never numbered these sections, and we did for the sake of logistics in this podcast. And maybe Camus did that on purpose because he doesn't really want us to think of these as logical sequences from one stage to another, but it creates a more impressionistic reading of how the events unfold. We talked last time how the narration was, non-linear. We didn't move from one sequence of events to the next. Rather, we got a handful of mini stories within mini stories, and you could see the connections if you were looking, but nevertheless, they weren't necessarily meant to be read in a linear fashion, strictly in that way. And that, I think, is important to reiterate, even though we will be referring to these as numbered sections.
So if we're on page 111, that's where we begin in the vintage edition for anyone reading along who does like numbers.
Before we deep dive into the main thrust of the themes in this second half, I have a question for you about education.
Okay. Yeah.
You just mentioned Montesquieu and climate, and perhaps you can begin by elaborating on that topic, but More specifically, in addition to mentioning Montesquieu, we have also talked about St. Augustine of Hippo. We have also talked about Rousseau vis-a-vis Locke as a different ways of thinking about liberalism. We are going to talk about Augustine, I think, again in a few minutes, as well as introduce a discussion about Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It seems to me that Camus is either quietly in dialogue with these and other texts, or at least passing familiarity with the themes in those texts is advantageous for readers of Camus' novel because it allows us to think more broadly about this political community, this fictional city and speech, as it were, in Camus' text. What role does education play for our characters that we are engaging with, but also ourselves as we engage this novel?
That's a large order question. I mean, I guess I can begin by saying Camus himself was certainly steeped in classical and liberal, as well as French civic education, so he would have been well familiar with these authors you mentioned and more. But there's no doubt that to understand any great text, one has to know something about other great texts. So the process of learning is itself an incessant one. And I mean, the great texts, the great authors speak to one another. And as we enter into this conversation, we want to know more, and we explore the text to further deepen our appreciation of this ongoing conversation, which then raises questions for us regarding our own political regimes or the places in which we live, the regimes in which we find ourselves, that touch on questions of what kind of citizens we ought to be and how we ought to act in under and through the laws of where we find ourselves.
Yeah, so if I understand you, suppose Camus had written this novel and it took place in Spain or the United States or in Australia or somewhere else in the world, we might actually have an expectation that the characters in the book would have read different things. There was an accusation way early on when Rambert accused Rieu of speaking the language of Saint-Just, and that prompted this discussion about Rousseau and the French Revolution. Perhaps if it was, again, set in a British outpost, maybe they wouldn't be debating over the French Enlightenment, but over Edmund Burke and Locke, or how to understand rights in an English setting or something like that. So it seems like what you're saying is the regime itself is shaping the texts, the very education, the very kind of moral imagination of its citizens.
Yeah, I mean, the question of education is perhaps the most politically charged question that one can ask. There's always a fight over education because the formation of minds and hearts and habits and practices of present and future citizens, it speaks to the direction that the regime will take. And so what rules or who rules is also a matter of what opinions and what ideas and what texts rule us. I mean, so the books that are read in any given regime will be different, perhaps, but they will also have different outcomes because they will shape the self-understanding and orientation of the citizens. So we are ruled by what we read and what we see, whether we know it or like it or not.
Let me take this discussion from high-level abstraction to more practical in the book. Why do you think weather is relevant, and especially in relation to the second half of Part 2?
Yeah, well, I don't want to make too much of it. Montesquieu says at one point in his big book, The Spirit of the Laws, that many things govern men. And one of these many things includes climate. We are embodied beings. We speak of the body politic. I mean, the political community is somewhere in space and time, and the physical geography, the topography, the climate, and the like are not incidental details that have an effect on our habits, practices, maybe even our culture and our activities more broadly. I mean, you can Google, and find that as temperatures increase, rates of violence go up. There are effects of these kinds of things. And Montesquieu says that this is only one of the many things. Religion, the type of government, various other things, of course, are involved in his broad synoptic perspective. But it's a detail worth considering.
Yeah, and so then in the text, we see in the very opening passages, the heat is beginning to take its toll. So much in the way that the heat can become a catalyst for crime, here in the text, it's a catalyst for a deepening of the depression that's gripping this political community.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we're here in Arizona, Luke. You know how hot it can get in August, and what's the effect of that?
That's right. Many people here described August as Midwest winter, that if you were to go to Ohio or Pennsylvania or anywhere in the New England in the middle of January, February, sometimes it can be a very depressing place to be because you're cooped up inside all the time. We do the same here. That heat can be oppressive.
Yeah, and it can shape our habits and practices and the way we live.
Well, let me springboard then from this discussion of education and how it shapes who we are back to the text and a lot of the major themes that are here. We have just now talked about civic education. There are other kinds of education: religious education, moral education, liberal education, education plain and simple. Whatever the education was of all of the members of this community in Iran, and it may not have been a community in the true sense as we have discussed in the previous episode, the lesson that Father Panaloo is giving in his sermon, the type of education that he is trying to give them, it seems not to have taken its effect, or it seems not to have had the effect that you would have expected it to have, except for maybe a handful of individuals who perhaps already had the right moral education beforehand.
Yeah, the narrator describes that there is something of a breakdown here with respect to the typical Oranians, let's say. I mean, there's even reference to a kind of growing suspicion among one another. And there's a passage that Theroux had recorded in his diary, which he refers to as a queer thing, where on the streetcars, he writes that the passengers, they all try to keep their backs turned to their neighbors, twisting themselves into grotesque attitudes in the attempt. The idea being, of course, to avoid contagion. At every stop, a cataract of men and women is disgorged, each in haste to put a safe distance between himself or herself and the rest, end quote. I mean, we know in our own lives a physical distancing from one another and a fewer and fewer face-to-face interactions, but kind of coterminous with this is a lack of trust and a lack of neighborliness and a care for one's neighbor that, as you say, Panaloo was certainly invoking, and maybe certain civic or moral educations would otherwise undergird. Along with this breakdown in terms of care and concern for the neighbor, you see the narrator describe a descent into a mood of reckless extravagance, the people focusing on thoughts of pleasure and indulgence in pleasures, right? Their timeline is so narrowed such that they only see this instant peril that faces them, and they engage in a frantic desire for life, but on the one hand, but also a frantic desire for pleasures and a broadening of morals, as the narrator puts it, right? When we lose the contact and the deeper relationship with our fellow human beings and the sense of concern for our neighbor, and we're focused mostly on ourselves and our immediate pleasures.
Trevor, this descent or fracturing of morality seems very similar. I think there are other types of literature that deal with plague that have similar themes. Here in our own department at ASU, we now have had 2 webinars that look at other texts that deal with plague, and at the time of our recording, we have a few more that are scheduled. Among the most famous is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which has a passage, a series of pages really, when plague befalls the city of Athens in the middle of a 27-year-long war against Sparta. We have just concluded a webinar on Boccaccio's Decameron, which is again another series of short stories about a plague befalling Italy. What is it that's going on here? And maybe you can, again, we're now throwing out even more authors to have to know about, but what's the kind of Reader's Digest version of what's going on with some of those texts and how it might help us understand the plague?
There is something of a similar pattern that the other authors that you mentioned account for, and these great Thucydides scholars, Clifford Orwin and Catherine Zuckert, who ran a webinar on Thucydides, reminded us that for Thucydides, as he observes this plague, he said that the most terrible thing of all was that a sense of despair set in among the Athenians that led people to think that all was hopeless, and as a consequence, they lost respect for the laws of God and man alike. They lost respect for order, and they were emboldened to indulge in all sorts of activities of quick enjoyment. And so this is a recurring pattern that when we descend into political disorder, if we do not have a robust moral order within us that may come by way of various educations, as you've listed, we are likely to join the spirit of the times. We are likely to follow into this descent into disorder ourselves and engage in activities that do not rise above the mere quest for pleasure and the like.
But then not everyone descends. We see, I think, immediately here in what is for us Section 7, Teru approaches Dr. Ryu and makes a kind of a pitch, a sales pitch of a sort, to organize a civic association, a volunteer association that is outside of the governmental structure, but that is somehow aiding in this process. And his motivation seems to be entirely grounded in morality. What's going on there?
This is very interesting, where, as you say, Teru realizes that that whatever action the government has been taking is generally failing. The government has tried to conscript citizens to help in the response as the manpower and the supplies and various things are in shortage, and that has been met with a poor response, as well as the call for voluntary help. So Teru really sort of takes this into his own hands and suggests, as you say, that we ought to get individuals together to take the initiative ourselves. And he underlines that he wants free men, because Ryu suggests at one point, well, the government and the prefect are thinking of maybe drawing from the prisons. But Teru suggests he wants free men for the action. I think it seems to me he suggests must be done by choice, not least of all because this is, an action that risks death. It's quite a risky endeavor. But this is, I think, a wonderful Tocquevillian insight that suggests that the freedom of choosing to engage, you might say, in civic and moral action is the action itself that reaffirms the freedom and our life of free association with one another. So this is a kind of education of a different kind, not a book learning, but civic and voluntary associations as a kind of schoolhouse for what we might say democracy, as Tocqueville put it.
I want to build on that for just a moment and actually quote Tocqueville at some length, because I had a very similar thought while reading these very same passages. From Democracy in America, Tocqueville writes, quote, "When citizens can associate only in certain cases, they regard association as rare and singular process, or as a rare and singular process, and they hardly think of it. When you allow them," he continues, "to associate freely in everything, they end up seeing in association the universal and, so to speak, unique means that men can make use to attain the various ends that they propose. Each new need immediately awakens the idea of association. The art of association then becomes, as I have said above," he's referring to something else he's written, "the mother science. Everyone studies it and applies it," close quote. Teru, I think, is a Tocquevillian of a sort. He has seen association. He perhaps, before his arrival in Iran, belongs to several other associations, whatever they might be. But he clearly has learned that lesson and sees that government is failing in its ability to handle this. Part of it's government's fault. It's the leaders who are there. And part of it is the people of Iran don't have a sense of community, don't have a sense of association. And so it's going to take a leader of a sort, Teru, organizing this. And I think he's going to Ryu because he knows that Ryu has the kind of moral capital to get approval from government, and also can put Ryu's imprimatur on this and motivate citizens to belong to this. And that maybe there's a potential for this association over the course of the novel to become, again, a kind of new beginning. We've talked about new beginnings in previous episodes. This might be the kind of germ seed for it.
The voluntary response among the citizens that Teru turns to and really kind of directs or initiates here is in direct antithesis to this descent into individualism or the isolation that we described a moment ago. On the one hand, this sort of descent into private and pleasurable life, as well as an alternative to this reliance upon the governmental orchestration or administration. Teru sees that there are problems in the city, and the citizens themselves can take a hand in remedial action. I guess, as you're saying, it doubly kind of serves the purpose of helping to resolve the problems before them while shaping these actors maybe into responsible citizens or budding citizens with a responsibility towards an emergent community. Yeah, and interestingly, Ryu himself admits, in light of what we just said, that what's true of all evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. So he too sees the possibility for a kind of self-transcendence, but he, as a medical doctor, is a little worried. And he expresses to Teru that this might be a reckless action. Is this the right course of action? And suddenly there's a turn to a discussion that's referred to as a possible gap between Ryu and Father Panaloo. So we're drawn back into the discourse that you had sketched for us last time regarding Father Panaloo's position. What to make of this possible gap or difference between Ryu and Father Panaloo in light of...
And curiously, it comes by way of a Socratic discussion about the possibility of God. We learn that Ryu doesn't believe in God. Ryu first asks Teru if he understands the stakes. He explains to him that his odds of surviving this are about 1 in 3. If he begins to sort of engage with members of the city of Iran who have been infected, cleaning homes and carrying sick people and dead bodies, there's a 2/3 chance that he will die and only a 1/3 chance that he will survive this. Teru responds by asking Ryu what Ryu thought of Father Panaloo's sermon, and then begins to press him even more about whether or not he believes in God or about his own morality. And so Teru's response to all of these kinds of empirical, practical questions are deeper questions about the role of morality, which suggests that Teru has some kind of coherent moral framework.
It raises the question as to maybe what the foundations of both of their beliefs or either of their beliefs might be. Teru pokes and prods at Ryu, and it seems that he highlights some of the inconsistencies in Ryu's position, because Ryu is saying, well, he's engaging in this action precisely because he needs to rebel against creation as it's found, which is to say creation with death. And Teru suggests, well, if your entire focus is on preventing death, then you're in an endless war, right? This is inevitably going to end in defeat because you have no cure for death. It's a never-ending defeat, as he puts it. And so what kind of a further discussion, what kind of further theological discussion does this lead us to? It seems to me that Ryu is something of an atheist humanist, maybe concerned with the body and preventing or minimizing death and disease, but Teru wants to know, what is this founded in? Do you have some kind of foundation for this morality? Because, as you suggest, maybe Teru does have some alternative foundation for morality.
And what's interesting to think about regarding Ryu is that the grounds of his atheism are at least somewhat inconsistent with a traditional view of Christianity. During this dialogue that these two characters are having, Ryu sort of concedes that his grounds for atheism are rooted in a two-stage logic that goes something like, if I believed in God, I would be a fatalist. I would let God handle everything. I would do exactly what Father Panaloo said, love my neighbor and let God take care of the rest. But I never see anybody become a true fatalist and let God handle quite literally every act of my existence, and therefore God must not exist. But that's not the vision, or that's not the understanding of God's role in the world, especially in Christian terms, in Catholic terms, Augustinian terms. It's not the vision that we get. I had mentioned in the previous episode that Father Panaloo's sermon is inconsistent on Augustinian grounds. I still had that in my mind as I was reading these later sections. The version of God's relationship to free will as well as to his own agency looks different.
Yeah, well, let me quote right from the text. I mean, there's something of a summation of Ryu's theological position here, where it's written, quote, "Since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits in silence," end quote. And so maybe you can elaborate in light of this what you mean further by the incoherence or inconsistency of Ryu's position and the Augustinian position.
To summarize the Augustinian position as a way of preface, or at least elaborating on this theme here, the text I was thinking of is Free Choice of the Will. It's one of Augustine's earliest writings. It's a dialogue in the Socratic tradition and takes the form of a dialogue between Augustine and a pupil of his. And one of the questions that's raised is, if God exists everywhere and if God has knowledge of everything that I'm going to do, isn't God then the cause of the evil that I do? How is it possible for God to exist in a place or in a way that has complete knowledge of everything, and yet I still have my own free will? And the answer that Augustine gives to his pupil, Evodius, is that God exists outside of space and time. Time itself did not even exist when God existed. And so God's knowledge of our behavior isn't knowledge that occurs in a temporal sense. For God, everything is in the eternal state of now. So God exists in that way, but that's not how we exist. That's not how humans exist. And so we can acknowledge that God is kind of in charge of everything, but he's not literally causing everything. We actually still have ownership. And the reason, again, I was thinking about all of this is because in light of Father Panelou's sermon and in light of Father Panelou being an Augustinian, I think Camus is at least pointing at some questions for us to ask, because Rieux's understanding of God is a caricature of the way a thoughtful believer, not just a Christian or a Catholic in the Augustinian sense, but really any believer or anybody who has a different moral framework from his empiricism. And I think that gets to one of the broader themes that we have been talking about, whether or not it's possible to have a coherent political community wherein the individuals in that community have different foundations of morality.
Yeah, we see a number of alternatives for these foundations, I guess. I mean, there is the rightly and the wrongly construed theological foundations. As you just mentioned, Rieux comes out with it and says that his teacher or his foundation for morality is the experience of suffering. I mean, it reminded me of Aeschylus and this sort of pathos, mathos, the idea of learning through suffering, a very Greek tragedian view that's focused, in his case, though, on really trying to improve the world. And then there's Theroux. Let's say a word about Theroux, because he tends to, on the one hand, he seems as though he agrees with Rieux, but then suggests that he has little left to learn. And Rieux is somewhat surprised by this and asks, do you really imagine you know everything about life? And Theroux responds by saying yes. And then Rieux presses him a little further in asking, well, in light of this plan for the groups that are going to go about engaging in helping with the plague, he asks him, what on earth prompted you to take this hand or this course of action? And curiously, Theroux responds, I don't know. My code of morals, perhaps. So he asks, your code of morals, what code? He summarizes so succinctly in a single word, comprehension. So on the one hand, he seems to know everything that he needs to know. On the other hand, he's not sure of why he's going about doing it other than this code of morals, which is itself comprehension. What might he mean by comprehension, and what might be the foundation for Theroux's morality since we're speaking of alternate possible or multiple possible foundations for morality in any given community?
One way of understanding what Theroux is getting at with this tension or this curious sort of paradox of knowing all he needs to know about morality and then not really having a clear, definitive answer, and yet then doubling down on comprehension as his code of ethics, is to look at it from a Socratic point of view. Socrates, any student of the classics will tell you, was wise because he knew that he knew nothing. And if Theroux has something like that in mind, that his complete worldview begins with an understanding or an appreciation of his own ignorance, of his own limitations, it's possible, I think, that Theroux could know all that he needs to know, but what he needs to know is that he is himself limited.
There seems to be something about this Socratic ignorance and a Socratic approach on the part of Theroux's character, not least of all in the manner of questioning others, including Rieux and Rambert and others. He knows something, but maybe indeed it is that he knows of what he knows not. And then there's actually at the beginning of the 8th section another Socratic theme that emerges, this time in the voice of the narrator, where there's a discussion of evil emerging out of ignorance, very much a Socratic understanding that knowledge and virtue are bound together, and ignorance and vice similarly. The quote here is that the evil that is in the world always comes of ignorance, and good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence if they lack understanding. On the whole, men are more good than bad. But the narrator adds that, however, isn't the real point.
No, all of that's really good. And there's probably very little that I could add except to say that I had a similar thinking about another allusion to a Socratic way of thinking about virtue and vice. One of the short versions that I think any instructor of Socrates that a teacher might give to his or her students is that in the Socratic view, what unifies virtue, or all the other virtues that exist, is knowledge. Curiously, we have this tension between a Socratic vision and, at least as I'm reading this text, the Augustinian vision, because Augustine's modification of the ancients actually turns on this question. For Augustine, the unity of all the virtues is not knowledge, but love of God, love of neighbor. And obviously for the Socratic tradition, from Socrates, Plato, through the Romans, is knowledge, knowing what virtue is and knowing what ought to be done, as we've seen before, is another way of thinking about what unifies knowledge. And so we're getting a kind of parallel dialogue within a dialogue about how to understand virtue. And to be honest, there's probably other ways of thinking about what unifies these virtues. But in the text here, we at least are seeing two different ways. And that tension, or those parallel tracks, whatever's going on here, is giving us a lot of food for thought, a lot of provocation for thinking about what morality is and the role of moral imagination in our actions.
Yeah, there's a richness to the text as Camus presents, even if only in summary form, a number of alternative ways of thinking about morality, possible foundations or foundationless morality, transcendent, immanent, and otherwise.
In fact, as I just said, there might even be another way of thinking about a different model. There's a Socratic model of morality. There's the Augustinian model for morality. I don't know what you would call it. Maybe it's the Stoic model of morality in Grand, who is really praised by the narrator for what he does. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's so Stoic or even philosophical. It's almost something of an everydayness, maybe a morality of everydayness. He's celebrated for his small daily effort, this kind of commitment by way of a quiet courage to simply do his duty, a theme that we've seen in previous episodes as well.
And what is he doing?
Well, he's engaging in the sanitary group that Theroux has initiated.
This is what's interesting to me. He's not going out collecting bodies, doing all this work. He's doing something really unique. He's just helping with the statistics and the record keeping. The narrator describes him as general secretary for the sanitary squads. What I wrote down in my notes is that the very vice that he has in terms of writing has become a virtue in his role here, specifically his obsession with detail, his perfection.
Yeah, I'm not sure, though. That might be true. And yet he suddenly, at one point, it's discussed how he can no longer properly undertake his administrative tasks in the city.
But one of the things that's really interesting here with Grand, just as you said, he's not partaking in these sanitary squads with his quiet courage, removing bodies and cleaning attics and doing all of the other activities that other members of these squads are taking place in. He actually asked for light duty, but offered 2 hours a day to help. And what is he doing as part of his voluntary role? He's merely helping with the statistics, which I thought was fascinating because we already saw this jab at the official statistics bureau that couldn't really figure all this out. He's helping with data collection. Any good statistician will tell you have to have good data collection. And so he is doing that role and he's thriving in this role, but in a really complicated way. If I can elaborate, the very vice that he has as a writer has become virtue as a general secretary statistician, by which I mean he obsesses over details of his novel and he seems unable to complete even a sentence. We saw in other passages in this part that we are discussing, he's changing every word. He can't think of the right adjective. He's doing he's still stuck on the first sentence of this grand novel because his obsession with detail is so profound. He can't get it right or he can't move beyond it. And yet in this role as a voluntary statistician, he is diligent. He makes sure the numbers are correct. He takes great care and makes sure that the ink that he uses dries on the page so there's no smudging. You can imagine there's probably a lot of small numbers written on the page, and he wants to make sure that the next person can read these numbers accurately and cleanly. And so that's his great virtue. And yet there's another wrinkle in this, and that he is devoting so much attention to trying to get his novel right, and so much attention, it seems, in getting these statistics right, that his actual main day job begins to falter, and he gets a kind of talking to by his superior.
Yeah, well, there's a quote here worth maybe turning to from the text where we're informed that Grand begins to display signs of absent-mindedness in the office, and he even gets a talking to by his superior, who says that, "I'm told that you're acting as a voluntary helper in the sanitary groups. You do this out of office hours, so it's no concern of mine. But the best way of making yourself useful in a terrible time like this is to do your work well. Otherwise, all the rest is useless." End quote. And this seems to be something of a theme that we've seen before, where there are invocations or suggestions that each need to do their duty, but it's not always self-evident what the task or the work or one's duty is.
That's right. We had a conversation about Ryu and his comment early on in the novel when he says to do your job as it ought to be done. And sometimes that presupposes you have a vision of what ought to be done. I think in the case of Grand, the reason the narrator praises him for his quiet courage is that he somehow recognizes that his real duty, his real job, is helping with these statistics. That is more important than his day job. That seems to be more important than his other things. And again, he's not perfect, because part of that absent-mindedness is his obsession with this novel. He's a flawed character. It might be the case that he needs to put that novel on the back burner while he's helping with these statistics, or maybe something else. But nevertheless, to wrap up this kind of conversation about morality, we're seeing, I think, in the text, multiple ways of thinking about the moral imagination, multiple ways of understanding what you're supposed to do. And again, as we've said before, it's not immediately clear whether or not you need to have one comprehensive view of morality, or whether or not multiple people with different versions of morality can still nevertheless come together through association and form a kind of complete whole that's bigger than the sum of the individual parts.
Yeah, or at least form some community that is functioning and that does preserve certain ideals like liberty and association and the like. But we can ask, just as a question, what is it that Camus is ultimately celebrating here? Which form of morality does he see as the highest, or is there a highest for him after all?
Trevor, we have now discussed several different models of morality that Camus has presented to us. Individuals who have looked at this plague or have responded to the plague by, as you pointed out, transcending themselves, transcending their circumstances, coming up to a higher point of imagination, of moral imagination. In the final section of part 2, we get what you might call several models of immorality or of corruption, and it's all predicated by Rambar's continued attempts to get out of the city. He kind of resigns to the fact that officially there's no way out. And he went through this stage of acceptance, and then finally he gets it in his head that maybe he could smuggle his way out. He goes about several of the cafes. Eventually he stumbles on a way out, it seems, from Cotard, who was another character that we had met before. And we suddenly discover that in this town, there's a black market of getting goods in and out of the city, circumventing the lockdown that the city has imposed. We are introduced to some shady characters of Spanish origin. We're not given much more than a last name or a pseudonym. And then finally, in his attempt to get out of town, Rambar has a brief run-in with one of the city magistrates, Othan, and that altercation or that interaction occurs when all of our other main characters are together. And as the magistrate leaves, Theroux says that the magistrate is public enemy number 1. And so here we have a city official who is somehow corrupted. We see actual individuals who are corrupted. We see this main character, Cotard, who is engaging in black market in corruption. What do we make of this?
Yeah, there no doubt is a extended reflection or discussion of varieties of corruption, even organized forms of corruption. So this is maybe the underbelly of the virtuous civic association. Here we have the negative manners in which, or the vice-ridden manners in which individuals associate as well. As you say, with Autant, he is referred to as enemy number one by Theroux in response to
something that Autant himself said.
And indeed, what he says is that it's not the law that counts, but punishment. So it's not that justice is important, but the meting out of punishment. And he says, Autant that is, says that this is for him something we must all accept, right? So he is clearly not concerned with justice. Cottard, as you mentioned, is revealed that he's an individual who is benefiting from the circumstances of the plague insofar as the police are after him or there's a warrant out for his arrest, but that, of course, is not being acted upon given the circumstances. So he is free, and what does he do with his liberty? Engages in the black market and activities of smuggling and the like. And then Rambert, there's extended discussion of his defense, or an attempted defense of his actions, and he insists in a couple of different passages that he is not coward. He wants to underline that there's a kind of courage in what he's doing. We even find that he fought among the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, that is against Franco, the losing side as he refers to it, and he says that he has been doing some thinking since then, not least of all about courage. And there's a remarkable exchange here where Rambert says, I know now that man is capable of great deeds, but if he isn't capable of a great emotion, well, he leaves me cold. And then Theroux responds by saying one has the idea that he is capable of everything. And Rambert disagrees by saying that what individuals are not capable of is suffering for a long time or being happy for a long time. And so we get this elaboration of what is driving Rambert. Indeed, it is a sense of love, as we know from before, a kind of romantic love. But there are a number of interesting exchanges here. We can't go into all of the detail, but clearly we see Rambert as a character who is maybe more reflective than we might have initially thought. He's undergoing perhaps some kind of transformation, somebody who has reflected on certain virtues like courage, as he says, and he is now open to the possibility perhaps of assisting with the actions of Theroux's civil group and contributing to the efforts of the city, maybe becoming one of the members of the city, even though he was originally a stranger or someone from afar. So we'll continue to watch for Rambert's transformation, perhaps along with the other characters as they continue to respond to this plague.
Indeed, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up this two-part discussion of part two of the novel. Just one little tiny postscript about the magistrate, Monsieur Autant, his depiction of law and order, or his depiction of punishment being really all that matters, to turn back to our opening on civic education and the types of texts that might be helpful for thinking about what Camus was doing in this novel. I thought of Les Mis, of the character Javert, this police officer who has a very punitive understanding of justice and who cannot see beyond that punitive sense of justice. And, any close reading of the play or of the original book or even the more recent movie eloquently depicts that kind of character and the limitations of having a worldview, a moral imagination that's framed strictly in those terms. I mention that only because I think as we proceed on to part 3, which we'll cover in our next episode, that might be something that's relevant for thinking about and just raising another question to have in the back of our mind as we continue our reading of this novel. And I think should just wrap it up there, and hopefully our audience will have more questions to prod us on this discussion and more insight to offer. And that's all we have for now.
See you next time.
Welcome to Pandemic Dialogues from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This series seeks to sustain the intellectual community we built with students, ASU colleagues, and the wider community while our regular speaker events are postponed. We offer the dialogues in 2 modes: a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work on pandemics and civic crisis, and this podcast with extended discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. More on the dialogues and the school is at scetl.asu.edu.
Почтенный председатель!